This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Chris Cummings, founder and CEO of Iconic Moments, a technology company that works alongside cultural institutions like museums to create digital collectibles that heighten engagement and fuel what the company calls crowd patronage. The conversation sheds light on the variety of factors that weigh on the operation of museums and the importance of storytelling when engaging museum patrons. And now, a conversation about cultural institutions and NFTs with Iconic Moments founder and CEO, Chris Cummings. Chris Cummings, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Chris, you're the founder and CEO of a company called Iconic Moments. I'll throw the same question at you as that I do at artists. If you were at a dinner party and somebody were to ask you, what's Iconic Moments? What do you do? How do you start to answer that for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first just say thank you so much, Craig, for having me and having us on the show. Really appreciate the opportunity and really love a lot of the episodes that you've done. And you've had some great guests before, so I'm humbled to even be invited here. But essentially, at Iconic Moments, our focus is really on helping to create the future of culture and the arts and to combine cultural institutions, digital art, and blockchain technology to help create new immersive experiences that can help create new ways to engage visitors and drive revenue. That might be through creating the idea of a digital twin of a museum in the metaverse. And I know the metaverse has kind of become a buzzword, but the idea of a digital twin of a museum makes a ton of sense. Or it might be in working with NFTs. And we know NFTs have become a very loaded word. But really it's an opportunity to help create new forms of digital ticketing, digital membership, or the idea of a digital lithograph that you can collect from a museum you love and a piece of art or artist you want to support.
You brought up a good point there, which is NFTs becoming a loaded word. Is it possible that we'll start seeing more and more adoption of all of the things that are tied to the strength and the nature of these blockchain collectibles, but move away from NFT as a term?
I think it's an interesting question that's being discussed a lot right now, right? Like, can a word become so loaded or stigmatized that it's impossible to reclaim, and instead it needs to be called something else? We're seeing some major platforms like Instagram call NFTs digital collectibles. We're seeing other platforms double down on the term NFT. I think in general, right, there's just been a huge misunderstanding of the technology and what the technology can do. This is not surprising. Like historically, whenever almost any new technology has come out that's changed human society over the last several hundred years, it's always criticized and always misunderstood. I think Keith Grossman, who was, the CEO of Time Magazine, who just left to run MoonPay, kind of said it best. We need blockchain technology to fall into the background to where it just becomes a part of our everyday life. You don't even know you're using it. You just use it because the technology does something that's an improvement over, the way that we interact and engage with the economy. And that's when the technology has finally gotten to that point. I think for us, we think that NFT is just a technical term to describe the idea of a digital certificate of ownership that interacts with smart contracts. And so for us, it's important to try to seek understanding of that term and what the technology can do. Because I think that still, most everyday people, if you were to ask them what an NFT is, would say like, oh, it's a Bored Ape, right? And they don't really understand what the technology is. And they've coupled the technology with the idea that it just represents some crazy piece of art, when really it's being used in every industry in the world. It could be a way of tracking sales, tracking the transportation of logistical equipment. It could be used for property, rent, IP. And so, I think there's a huge need to kind of slow down and really explain the technology in a way that people can get what it can do.
Can you talk about some of the constraining parameters on museums in the 21st century that would encourage, maybe not even museums, but let's just say cultural institutions to be interested in NFTs or digital collectibles?
Yeah, I think it's first important to kind of look at, is the model behind museums sustainable right now? Or is that model broken, right? COVID-19 had a particular impact on museums around the world. Over 94% of museums closed at the exact same time. At the start of the pandemic, the prediction is that 15% of museums were at risk of closing permanently. Worldwide, that number reached over 37%. Here in the United States, there was literally close to 50% of museums that had a real risk of them closing. And the truth is that museums were in trouble long before COVID, and COVID was just gasoline on the fire. And so the question is why, right? Like, why are museums facing these sustainability issues? There's some unique differences in the U.S. where there's very little government support for our museums in comparison to other countries around the world. But really, for us, when we asked this question and we looked at the impact of COVID, it came down to the fact that museums really only know how to drive revenue through in-person revenue models, right? That's tickets, that's membership, that's galas, it's event rentals and experiences. And so when doors were forced to close shut, they really had no other way to be able to support themselves. Other industries have long figured out ways to be able to engage and drive revenue digitally and to come up with diverse revenue streams. But that really isn't the case in the museum industry. And so for us, we just said, why is this model broken? Because it's so based on this in-person experience. And can blockchain technology help to create a new digital model for the industry? Not to replace the idea of in-person experiences, but can it supplement it, right? Can it help create new things that you can't do? And that's the part that excited us is, can you engage someone around the world that may never physically be able to walk through the door of a museum, but still wants to engage with that museum, is willing to give that museum money because they care about whatever that museum stands for. And I think that is the most exciting part, because museums are sitting on the most important cultural assets. They have huge collections of content. And there's sort of this huge opportunity to really bring all of this online in a really, really immersive way for the first time. Also, there's some things you can do digitally you can't do physically. Only 2% of a museum's collections on average are publicly visible. The other 98% sits in an archive, right? And so there are no physical constraints digitally, right? You can really not only preserve but create access to these materials. And so that's really the area that we've explored is, what is a way of using digital technology to help create an entire new way to experience museums, and on the museum side, create support for museums.
My understanding is that before Iconic Moments, you started a company called Pass It Down, which uses technology to help museums engage visitors with storytelling, right? So can you kind of talk about how you've been able to leverage some of your experience from Pass It Down as you've launched Iconic Moments?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working with museums now for over 8 years. Believe it or not, when I started Pass It Down, the original vision was to create digital storytelling tools just for families. I'd unfortunately seen my mom battle multiple sclerosis and then early onset dementia in her 40s. And I remember going through that process, trying to hire a biographer, and I couldn't afford it. I was an 18-year-old kid. And I had this idea of, well, what if we could put a digital biographer in everyone's pocket to help capture stories, record stories?
Wow.
And the amazing thing is, as I was building this for families, we started to gain some kind of like national recognition and these big awards and competitions. And all of a sudden I was approached by some of the world's biggest brands and brand new museums being built saying, I know you built the storytelling technology for families, but we could really use that technology ourselves to help capture and tell our own stories within our collection, but also stories of visitors that walk through the museum.
Right.
And this was a world I knew nothing about, right? I didn't start Pass It Down originally planning to help create the future of museums or to work in corporate history or corporate storytelling, but fell in love with it once we really were approached to be able to do this. And I think, the thing that I became really passionate about is digging through these archives and collections, you find the most amazing stories in the world.
Right.
But when we looked and said, like, how are these stories being conveyed? It was so antiquated, right? It was so incredibly antiquated. I think that if you ask like how do kids learn about culture today? We're still teaching culture in a pretty antiquated way in our schools. We don't really do field trips to museums anymore. That model really doesn't work as much as it did as like when I was a kid and
Mm-hmm.
when you were a kid. And so we're like, well, what does it look like to take all these stories and this information and kind of bring it to life? And so I think we really took our experience with archives, our experience with collections, our experience of how do we take this information and create context between it. Archives at the time they were just repositories. You could find a million files, but they weren't drawing the story between the pieces. You couldn't leave with the idea of like what meaning is attached here. And so that experience really, I think, paid dividends in looking at the idea of blockchain technology because we've been working with museums for a while. We really understand their values and their goals. And we looked at NFTs and didn't say, oh, this is a get rich scheme, right? Do something quick. It was, okay, how can this technology really help supplement what museums are already doing?
Is that kind of the underlying theme behind what you guys call crowd patronage? It's a new form of engagement for these museums. It's a new way to make the traditional patron feel like they have an active role or a dialogue with the institution.
I think it was 13, 14 years ago when, Nina Simon wrote The Participatory Museum and really helped to kind of take a pivotal turn in the museum field that we should look at museums as being more than one-way streets. Traditionally, the way the museums are built, you come into the museum, you're kind of taken through a guided experience, and then you leave. And we never really capture your experience, your reflection, or your stories, because your story itself is a unique take on whatever the museum has. And so the idea of the participatory museum is that museums should be two-way streets, that every person's reflection and story has the ability to add to the essence of the museum itself and should be captured and can be captured. I think it goes to this idea of a perception of how we engage with museums, what sense of authority we have, what sense of ownership we have with whatever's within the museum collection itself. And so, when we look at the idea of crowd patronage, to us, it's really this idea of how are you engaging and building relationships with your patrons, your members, and allowing them to be a part of what is being built and to feel like it is one large participatory experience.
I know that I've seen some museums in Europe, in different places, that last year may have kind of rushed into the NFT market to sell a digital version of something in their collection. But it seems like your company is espousing more of a holistic plan or a view to kind of come alongside a museum to create kind of a plan going forward. Can you kind of describe the difference between a museum kind of one-off selling an NFT versus the services you guys come along and provide? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah, absolutely. NFTs, part of what makes the technology so exciting is they kind of function with a smart contract like a key. And you can create as many doors or experiences that are unlockable with that key as you design. So you could say if you own this NFT is a digital lithograph, right? So it's a piece of art you're collecting. But you can also say that if you own this NFT, it can function as a ticket to the museum. You could say it can function as a membership to the museum. You could have it to be a key to a digital experience that only you can have if you own that NFT. That could be access to a behind-the-scenes experience with museum's curator. It could function as a digital ticket to a digital museum that the museum has. So really, it's figuring out, what are all the different experiences that you want to create as a set of values that come with the ability to purchase this NFT, and does that allow you to engage and create value for your patron and to educate your patron, to do something meaningful where that patron has value. If you think about it, it's not too different from the idea that if you donate to a museum, the museum's like, okay, in exchange for your donation, we're going to give you something, right? It's trying to say, is there a more kind of full, well-rounded thing that can happen with the idea of this NFT? So I think that, some of the early examples of NFTs in museums in Europe that you're pointing to really were focused more on just the idea of making money from something.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't really focused on the idea of creating an experience. And I think also, they didn't take the time to really tell the story behind the artwork, the story behind the artist. I mean, museums have a long tradition of taking items within their collection that they have the rights to do this to, and turning those into lithographs you can buy in the museum store, right? Like the idea of a limited edition print physically is not a new concept.
Right.
And museums have felt like that is, well allowed for them to be able to do. Sometimes those items are in the public domain, or sometimes they have the right to do that from however they acquired that artwork. And so, we don't see anything wrong with this idea of a digital lithograph, as long as it's in alignment with the same thing as doing the physical. We just think that you have to do the same things a museum always does, right? Tell the story, make sure that you're creating something valuable and meaningful, and to do so the right way, I guess is what I would say.
So can you tell me more about the Art Pass? What exactly is the Iconic Moments Art Pass, and what doors does that open up with that key?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this past October, we made a decision to create the Iconic Moments Art Pass, which is essentially functioning as a Genesis pass. It's kind of like a technical term in Web3, but think of it kind of like a membership pass to Iconic Moments. And if you own that art pass, then you essentially have the right to do several different things. The first is that you have the first right to essentially purchase any NFTs or digital collectibles that Iconic will release from the network of museums that we work with. The second part is that if you hold on to that pass, it'll give you access to special events and experiences that Iconic Moments will do with museums and other cultural institutions in the future, along with some fun digital surprises along the way. And really what we wanted to do was to be able to build a very concentrated base of collectors that say, I do want to support museums. I do want to support cultural institutions. Because I think a lot of museums go, does anyone actually, do collectors actually want to engage with us, right? We're a museum. I think that's a question we hear from almost every museum. And we go, right. Yeah, 100% they do. We proved it.
Right.
And so we announced that we were going to have 1,250 art passes, and we're blown away by the response. We had over 35,000 people line up in the first 4 days to sign up to get in line to purchase that art pass. We sold out instantly the moment that part pass went live. And I think it really showed that, there is this huge base sometimes of traditional art collectors, but a lot of this is new digital art collectors that want to engage with museums and want to engage with these institutions. And part of our value is in creating the idea of this aggregate or network and bringing all those institutions together for the first time. I think one thing we hear a lot too, that's pretty interesting from digital art collectors, is that they'll often say that, look, I was really intimidated by the traditional art world. I was really intimidated walking into a museum. And, digital art was really the first time I felt like I could engage in the art space in a way that took away sort of any of that fear. And this seems like a nice next step into that world of art that wouldn't have stepped into the past. And I think that's part of what's really fun here is this idea that we're really focused on building a digital community that we do interact with in the real world, but we're tying in some of the most storied institutions in the world and trying to bring new visitors and new patrons in.
So how do you think the breakdown looks there? I mean, are the majority of those 35,000 or the 1,250 that actually collected, are the majority of those coming from the crypto space, from the NFT world? Or do we see this as a possible bridge where we can start seeing some more of those traditional art world patrons, collectors, kind of dipping their toe in because they see that the museum is involved and it's a little bit less intimidating? Is this a conduit?
Yeah, our long-term focus is on being a bridge, right? A bridge between Web 2 and Web 3, a bridge between museums and cultural institutions and digital artists and digital collectors. And we actually think that the two have a lot to offer one another. Museums are some of the most respected organizations in the world. Most artists, right? They're at the top of their bucket list is the ability to have their work featured in a museum, right? It's just the sense that your work will live forever, it'll be preserved forever, and it's almost like a stamp of approval, right, about the quality of your artwork. And so these cultural institutions carry mass amounts of trust and respect, but they really are in need of engaging new audiences, younger audiences, and finding new ways to drive revenue. And then you have Web3, which is fighting for respect, right? And fighting for credibility. But on its own, it's built this entire new field of digital art, although technically digital art's been along a lot longer in blockchain technology. But you have a huge base of younger collectors, a huge base wanting to engage in the space, and they're spending billions of dollars to do so. And so for us, we think there's this interesting opportunity to bridge the two together, to bring museums into Web3 and Web3 into these institutions, to help create this new patron that these institutions are really seeking, and we think ultimately serves society in a really good way. Initially with the Art Pass, though, we really wanted to focus first and foremost on engaging Web3 and digital art collectors. And so it's such a blanket term, right? When we think of like NFT buyers, we don't really think of it as like one absolute, right? We break it down to several buckets. We think that you have sports NFT buyers that are very, very separate. They're not who we're going after. You can think of this as anyone engaging in Top Shot and UFC and the NFL. You have kind of your degenerate NFT side, which is not an area we're really engaging with. But then you have like a whole set of projects, businesses, and communities that have really focused on artwork. And so we really went to those organizations from the very beginning saying, like, this is what we're doing. Do you find this interesting? Do you want to support this and interact with your community? And there are some amazing organizations out there that are really building a very different type of Web3 company, very focused on art in a really, really positive way. Proof Collective has done an amazing job at doing this with their Grails releases, which we were a part of Grail Season 2 with the White House Association and doing the first White House NFT. Goda's done an amazing job. GM DAO's done an amazing job. Art Blocks is phenomenal. Absolutely. So we're very much on that side of the house. Sure. But long term, yes. I mean, we think being a bridge and bringing traditional in is important. I think it's going to take time to get there.
In this scenario, the buyers may be less driven by speculation and more driven by, patronage, sense of community, and opportunity to own a piece of something that's typically only in a museum. And that being said, maybe customer engagement in this segment wouldn't see the same cool down as we would see across a broader NFT market. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the only area of NFTs that isn't down is art. It's very, very, it's kind of the real art side of the house. I mean, like, I think the latest reports have sports NFTs down over 90%. We've seen the DGen side of the house, NFTs are down 90%. The art industry, whether it's traditional art or digital art, is thriving. Art sort of rises above all tides, and it continues to excel. And so I think that stands, it's a testament to the art industry and the value of what art is, that people continue to collect in art and to believe in it, because it shouldn't really have an effect based on other factors, right? If you like the art, you like the artist, you want to engage with it, that doesn't change.
What is on the calendar? Like, I know the timing of announcing releases is kind of tricky because the wheels of the museum world move at a certain pace. There are lots of lawyers involved, and you want to make sure things are announced at, not to disparage you. I know that you have your JD.
So many lawyers involved, and no, you don't have to worry. I mean, lawyers get jokes about them for a reason. I completely get it. And there's so many lawyers involved.
Yeah, but, so the wheels of the museum world move at a certain pace. And I know that in a perfect world, you would be able to, announce releases and people see them coming down the line and know exactly what's coming. But today, is there anything specific that we can kind of share with listeners about exciting opportunities that are on the horizon?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny, right? Like people want to know everything, but at the same time, if you shared everything, you take away the sense of excitement and thrill and fun that comes into it. And so, for us, we're excited for our kind of first major art pass release that will happen in the first quarter this year. But when we do make that announcement, from the moment we do the announcement to the sign up to it going live will happen in a very short window of time. And so, it's one of those things where you kind of just have to wait to make the marketing work for the experience. But there are some things that we really can share. Our one of our first releases was with the White House Association, which was founded by Jackie Kennedy in the 1960s. And so, we took one of the very first piece of artwork by a African American woman to hang in the White House, which is Alma Thomas's Resurrection, which was acquired by the Obama administration in 2014 or 2015, had that reinterpreted by a digital artist. And that experience and that release went so well that we'll be doing a new set of releases for the White House Association that'll be coming later this year. And obviously, the collection of the White House Association is amazing. And there's so much that can be done, not just with their original collections, but this idea of really bringing in new digital artists in to have a part of that experience across the board. One organization we're working with that we really believe in and are excited about is the Women's Suffrage Monument. So this is the next national monument that's being built in the National Mall in DC. And believe it or not, it's the first women's national monument to be built in the National Mall. You would have thought that we would have had a women's monument hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We haven't. And so this is a obviously congressional approved monument. And suffrage is something that most monuments are so backwards looking, right? It's around something that you remember, but it doesn't really apply to today's times. Suffrage is a fight that's going on today. The fight for women's equality is a fight going on today. The fight for people's right to vote is a fight that's going on today. And so it's really exciting to be working to help fundraise for the creation of a national monument, to help bring awareness to the story of the national monument, and to help build something that will live on forever, right? That anyone, that our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids will be able to experience, and to help create a new way to be able to support the creation of this monument. If you think about it, it takes 7+ years to actually build a monument. We'll digitally be able to show this monument and create experiences years in advance, which creates a better way to engage with donors in relations. And so that's something we're really excited about. That project has been endorsed. The Women's Monument has been endorsed by so many great people. Every First Lady, has come together to support and be an ambassador for that project. Some amazing people as well, people like Rosario Dawson and others are all standing behind it. And then we obviously are working with some of the world's top museums, top art organizations, and others, doing everything from preparing NFT releases to building digital twins of those experiences. So it'll be a busy year, but we're really, really excited.
Well, that story reminds me of just how much those monuments rely on the collective whole of the community to donate to have them come to fruition. And even I remember the really interesting learning about the Washington Monument, how basically they were constructing the Washington Monument and halfway up the spire just ran out of funds. And if you look at the Washington Monument, there's a clear point where the limestone is a different color because it's sat dormant for so many years. And so it's really interesting, I think, that you can share that vision and get support and raise the funds in a way that people can kind of visualize it, with the technology we have nowadays with AR and VR, and to be able to really get people on board, right?
No, absolutely. And I think that people sometimes think the government just writes this blank check to build a monument. It's not what happens at all. Most of the modern monuments that were built were all supported by sort of major companies that build military technology and weapons, and think of companies like Boeing and others, right?
Mhm.
And so the idea of building sort of a women's monument around suffrage is a very, very different thing. The funding sources for that are very different. And for us, we wanted to make sure that we told the history of this fight through the NFTs that we'll be doing. So, for example, in the early 1900s, when women were fighting for the right to vote, they kept getting thrown in jail so often that Tiffany's, the jewelry company, ended up designing this jail cell pin that they would give
Wow.
women who had gone to jail fighting for the right to vote, and the women would wear the jail cell pin on their label. And it became this visual rallying call of kind of the fight for the right to vote, the cost in this fight. And so, for us, we really looked at that story and these pins as something that really had been lost in time, but it was a great idea to be able to bring these jail cell pins back. And so for us, for example, if you're supporting the Women's Monument, not only will you get a digital version of this pen, but you'll also be mailed a physical version of this pen as well to be able to wear and to be able to show. And it's tying in the history and the story and the storytelling of this all together in experience to be able to do something really amazing, and again, to build something that will live forever.
When you were describing the White House Association release, you talked about a digital reinterpretation of the work. And it reminds me of a conversation I had last year with Jason Bailey, also known as Art Gnome. I had him on to talk about digital deaccessioning. And, there was one of the points he brought up is that the institution that's kind of straight up selling the digital version of something in the collection, that raises a lot of questions about who is going to own that digital version of that artwork in the metaverse versus working along with a contemporary artist to reinterpret the piece and selling something that serves all the same purposes but is something new and contemporary and doesn't affect whatever rights will exist in a virtual world. Is that something that you guys have been thinking about as you put these collections together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of digital deaccessioning is this really interesting question of ownership and who owns something in a museum, right? I think to some degree, there have been several really good takes on this. One of my colleagues, Dr. Frances Little, became one of the first people in the world to write her PhD about the intersection of blockchain and museums, and this idea of, is this technology museum should embrace, and this question of ownership. And to some degree, there's this question around, should a museum be viewed really as the sole owner of a piece of history or a cultural artifact? Or is there value in this idea of challenging this concept of ownership, right? If you could take an item in a museum, and it's not technically legally changing ownership of this item, right? In most instances, NFTs are not actually selling physical ownership of the asset. But if, let's say you do create an NFT of something in the museum, and that NFT might have 5,000 units or additions to it, does that actually create a sense of shared ownership of history versus just the museum saying or viewing themselves as the owner? Is that a positive thing? Or is it a negative one? I think that this idea of challenging the idea of the museum being viewed as the sole owner is potentially a good topic to explore for some reasons. But in the particular instance of what we did with the White House Association in this case, right? We looked at the historical collection, and the White House Association rightly views themselves as the people's house, right? In their mind, they don't own the collection. Everyone owns the collection. They already have this view of a shared ownership. And so they did not want to take something in the original collection, rightfully so, and turn that into an NFT that could or could not be purchased, right? Because everyone already owns it. But instead, they and us were both really inspired by what items that are in the public domain are supposed to do. They're supposed to be, the reason we have public domain laws, they're supposed to be able to create and inspire new works, right? They're supposed to be a way to generate new ideas and create more cultural value and more cultural works across the board. And that's one reason why we find the idea of taking new artists and having them to both reinterpret and be inspired by items within the public domain is such an interesting area to get into.
In my mind, you are out there having conversations with dozens, if not hundreds of museums. And just from your perspective, how do you think our definition of what the museum is going to change over the next 10, 20 years? I mean, will museums be more virtual? Will there be purely virtual museums? How do you see that concept of what we define as a museum changing over the next couple of decades?
Yeah, I'll first, take a skeptical eye and say where we are and then where I hope we'll go. I think one disappointing factor we saw in sort of this retrospective over COVID-19 is that the AAM's report and looking at the impact of COVID, I think it was like a 2-year retrospective on it. They asked and surveyed museums around the country, what did you try new during COVID-19, right? What did you try new to anything, right? It could be doing virtual classes, virtual tours, Zoom backgrounds. It could be physical stuff. The answer for 60% of museums was absolutely nothing new. For 60% of museums, even in light of COVID-19, they were a deer in the headlights that tried nothing new. And, I think it's, obviously disappointing, but it's something good to reflect on. Like, that's where museums kind of are now. That is the status quo. And we know that needs to change. At the exact same time, we're seeing some museums try some really new and exciting endeavors. We are starting to see in different parts of the world the creation of purely virtual museums. And I think that in some instances, the idea of a pure virtual museum makes a ton of sense. Building physical museums can be really expensive. Mm-hmm. And they're expensive. It's kind of like buying a luxury car, right? Not only are they expensive to buy, the more expensive part is everything afterwards. It's the maintenance, right? They're expensive to run. It's incredibly expensive to preserve materials in a way that they'll last for forever. And so there are some museums that were in the process of fundraising and had raised, say, like 50, 60 million, but they needed 100, 120 million. And they just said, oh, we're not going to build a museum. And then nothing happened. Right? It's crazy, right? They could have taken, a fraction of that and built a virtual experience and then really created ways to engage worldwide audiences, but it would just be different. So, my hope is that we see museums really look at digital technology in a way that's focused on how do we engage a new generation of visitors, because kids are so technologically savvy. How do we extend the reach of our museum worldwide? Mm-hmm. How can we create more sustainability for the industry? How can we focus on telling more stories of those items within the archives and collections? How can we make sure that if 2% are publicly on display, that other 98% really are not just preserved, but shared? I think one of my biggest frustrations is what's the point of preserving everything if no one gets to interact or experience it?
Right.
I mean, I'm thankful it's preserved, but I feel like I think the industry has been so focused and they've done a really good job of that first half of the coin, but the other half has largely been untouched. And I think that that's the other half of their job.
It feels like there's a real opportunity for non-collecting museums to pop up. I've had guests on who have created ICAs, which non-collecting around, specific themes, but it just feels like there are opportunities for someone to have a space that fashions exhibits around borrowing that work that is cloistered away in a basement or basements of museums all over the country, right? And what does that turn into in terms of how to provide a space that's engaging with all the different technology and storytelling that could go along with that? When you don't have a collection, the overhead is a significantly different equation, right?
No, 100%. I think that and I think that you see individuals or small groups essentially trying to do this just in pretty informal ways for this exact reason. I think also it's important to note, when we talk about the idea of a digital museum, it needs to do something different than what a physical museum can do. Otherwise, you're just mimicking, right? You're mimicking a space. I've never heard anyone brag about going to a virtual tour. I don't know about you, right? I've never heard anyone go, man, I had one hell of a virtual tour, right? Like, they're okay because they're usually 360 cameras of a physical space. You click around on the arrows, you go, I just wish I was there in person. If we're going to build a digital museum, it needs to do something you can't do in the real world. If you're going to build a digital museum, let's say it's a World War II museum, you don't need to look at a photo of a World War II plane on the wall the way you would in the physical museum. You need to see the plane fly overhead, right? If you're in an art museum, like let's say it's a Van Gogh museum, you don't need to look at the photos of the pictures of and paintings of Van Gogh. You need to step into the painting. It needs to do things you can't actually do, because then you're creating a new experience and one that is creating new value. And, I hope, right, that AR and VR technology gets there. I'll admit that I think the problem we have with that technology is hardware adoption rates. Like 0.001% of the population actually owns a VR headset. And I still think we're a long way off. So we're personally very passionate about this idea of creating browser-based experiences that look like AAA video games that are cloud rendered, because that's the technology we have. VR and AR can create amazing experiences, but we've got to figure out how to tackle people actually owning the technology, because otherwise it doesn't really do a lot of good. And, part of a museum's mission is accessibility. And a part of accessibility is what technology do we actually have? What do we have to use? If you're just creating technology for really expensive hardware, by its very nature, very few people ever have a chance to access it.
Well, Chris, I think I've taken up all the time I asked for. I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me today about the work you're doing, changing the way we interact with museums, questioning the whole sense of ownership and artwork. And I really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you, Craig. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to chat. And, thank you again for the opportunity to be able to come on the show.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.